The locket was a jagged piece of silver, warped by a heat that had long ago cooled into the gray ash of memory, yet it still bit into Silas Thorne's palm like a living thing. He sat his horse on the high ridge of the Broken Bone Pass, looking down at the valley of Oakhaven where the shadows stretched out like long, skeletal fingers reaching for the dying sun. He had spent 10 years trying to outrun the smell of kerosene and the sound of a woman's scream, riding until his eyes were bloodshot and his soul was as dry as the alkali flats of Nevada. But the West was not a frontier, it was a cage made of horizons, and no matter how far a man rode, he eventually found himself staring at the same stars and the same sins. He had returned not for the gold being pulled from the creek or the hollow promise of a new start, but because he had heard a name whispered in a rain-slicked alley in San Francisco, the name of the man who had struck the match and let Silas take the fall. The descent into the valley was a slow, punishing crawl through the blue hour, that fragile time between light and dark when the world looks like it's being erased. Silas was a man composed of hard angles and a silence that felt like a threat. His duster was stained with the dust of 4 states, and his eyes had the flat, dangerous look of a wolf that had forgotten how to belong to a pack. As he rode past the skeletal remains of the McCready livery, the wind kicked up a swirl of red grit that tasted of iron and ancient grudges. He didn't stop at the saloon, though the amber glow of the windows promised the only kind of peace he knew how to buy. Instead, he kept riding until the fences turned from rotted wood to sturdy cedar, marking the boundary of the High Willow Ranch. Clara was on the porch when he arrived, a shadow framed against the warm light of a kerosene lamp. She didn't have a rifle in her hand, but the way she stood, shoulders squared, chin tilted in a line of defiance, was a weapon in itself. She was thinner than he remembered, her hair pulled back in a severe knot that showed the sharp, elegant tragedy of her cheekbones. She watched him dismount, her gaze tracking the rhythmic jingle of his spurs with an intensity that made the air between them feel thick enough to choke on. 10 years of silence crashed against the porch steps as he took off his hat, revealing the silver that had crept into his temples like frost. "The crows told me a ghost was riding up the trail," she said, her voice a low, melodic rasp that vibrated in Silas's marrow. "I told them ghosts don't have enough weight to leave tracks in the dust. I was wrong." "Tracks are easy to make, Clara. It's the destination that's hard to find," Silas replied, his voice sounding like gravel grinding in a dry creek bed. He didn't move toward her. He stood by his horse, the animal's heavy breathing the only heartbeat in the yard. "I heard Miller is the mayor now. I heard he's building a monument to himself out of the land he stole from your father." Clara let out a short, jagged laugh that died in the wind. She stepped into the light, and for the first time Silas saw the cane she leaned on, a polished piece of hickory that bore her weight with a stubborn grace. The fire hadn't just taken her home, it had taken the effortless way she used to move through the world. "Miller owns the bank, the law, and the very air we breathe in Oakhaven. He's graciously allowed me to keep this house on the condition that I marry him on the 1st of the month. He calls it a union of families. I call it a slow-motion hanging." "You won't touch her," Silas whispered, the words a vow that felt like a spur to his own ribs. "You're a decade late for promises, Silas Thorne," she snapped, the fire in her eyes bright enough to rival the lamp. "You left me in the cinders. You let the town believe you were a monster because you were too proud to admit you'd been outplayed. You didn't stay to fight then, so why should I believe you'll stay now? Because you found a little gray in your hair and a lot of regret in your pockets." Silas didn't defend himself. He couldn't. He had spent 10 years believing that his absence was a shield, that by taking the blame for the fire, he had bought her safety. He hadn't realized that he had simply cleared the field for a predator like Miller to move in. I didn't come to ask for a place by the fire, Clara. I came to put one out. I found the man who gave Miller the matches. He's in a cell in Laramie, and he's talking. But the law in Oakhaven won't listen to a ghost. They'll only listen to a woman with a grievance." The following week was a study in restrained agony. Silas stayed in the barn, working the land during the day with a grim, relentless focus. He mended the corrals that had been neglected for years, dug out the silt-choked spring, and replaced the shingles on the roof until his hands were raw and bleeding. He did it in a silence that was almost religious, a penance carved out of wood and sweat. Clara watched him from the kitchen window, her presence a constant, radiating heat that he felt even when his back was turned. They spoke in fragments over plates of cold salt pork, half-finished sentences that hung in the air like smoke. There were almost moments that felt like they would shatter the world. The way her hand almost brushed his when she handed him a mug of coffee, the way he almost reached out to steady her when she tripped on the porch steps. Every look was a battlefield, a clash between the love that had been buried under a decade of ash and the pain that had grown over it like thorns. "Why did you really leave, Silas?" she asked one evening, the sky outside a violent shade of orange. She was sitting on the porch, the hickory cane resting against her knee. Silas leaned against the porch railing, looking out at the silhouette of the mountains. "I left you that night, Clara, and because I knew Miller was the kind of man who writes letters to the judges and sheriffs, he'd torture the town to get to you. If I was gone, there wouldn't be a target for him. It was Cumper." "The point was me, Silas," she said softly, the first hint of vulnerability cracking her voice. "It was always me, and you left me to face it alone because you couldn't stand to be the man who failed. You were a coward not because you ran from the law, but because you ran from the sight of my pain." The internal conflict gnawed at Silas. He knew that by bringing the truth to light he was walking into a trap. Miller wouldn't go quietly, and the sheriff was on the mayor's payroll. If Silas stayed to see justice done, he would likely end up at the end of a rope before the sun went down on the trial. He was choosing between a life of drifting anonymity and a death that meant she was free. The external pressure mounted on Wednesday. Miller rode into the yard with 3 men, their horses kicking up a storm of dust that tasted of malice. Miller hadn't changed. He still wore fine broadcloth and carried himself with the bloated arrogance of a man who had never been told no. "The prodigal son returns," Miller drawled, his hand resting on the pommel of his saddle. "I heard a drifter was playing at being a ranch hand. I should have known it was you, Thorne. You always had a penchant for things that didn't belong to you." "Everything on this ranch belongs to Clara," Silas said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated with suppressed violence. He didn't have his guns on him. He had promised Clara he wouldn't bring that ghost into her house, but his hands were steady. "Including her future, which doesn't include you." Miller laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "The wedding is Sunday. The invitations are out. If you're still in the valley by sunset tomorrow, Thorne, I'll have the sheriff arrest you for the arson of 76, and this time there won't be a trial, just a sturdy branch and a short drop." That night the sky broke. A torrential rain turned the ranch yard into a mire of red mud. Silas sat in the barn, the smell of wet hay and horse sweat thick in the air. He had his gun belt laid out on a hay bale, the cold steel of the Colts reflecting the flickering lantern light. He could leave. He could ride out tonight, vanish into the storm, and be 50 miles away by dawn. It was what he was good at. It was how he had survived. The barn door creaked open. Clara stood there, drenched, her shawl clinging to her shoulders. She didn't have her cane. She was leaning against the doorframe, her eyes searching his in the shadows. "He's going to kill you, Silas," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe, but he's not going to marry you." "Then be a wolf," she whispered, stepping into the light. The anger was gone, replaced by a raw, naked longing that had been 10 years in making. "But be my wolf, Silas Thorne. Don't leave me to mourn you twice. If you're going to fight, fight for the man who stayed, not the ghost who ran." He crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms. The contact was a shock, a collision of cold rain and burning heat. He kissed her with a desperation that tasted of salt and years of wasted time. It wasn't a soft moment, it was a battle. It was the sound of two people finally surrendering to the truth that they were broken, but they were broken together. The climax didn't happen in a hail of bullets at noon. It happened in the quiet, stifling heat of the town hall on Sunday morning. The town had gathered for a wedding, but Silas Thorne walked through the back doors with a man in irons, the henchman from Laramie who had finally broken. The sheriff moved to intervene, but the look in Silas's eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't the look of an outlaw, it was the look of a man who had already accepted his death and therefore had nothing to fear. "The fire was a land grab, John," Silas said to the sheriff, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "The confession is signed. The motive is in Miller's ledger in the safe. Arrest me if you have to, but don't let a murderer walk out of here with a bride." Miller reached for a hidden derringer, his face a mask of panicked rage, but Silas was faster. He didn't shoot to kill, he shot the gun out of Miller's hand, the roar of the Colt deafening in the small space. In the ensuing chaos, the truth, long suppressed by fear and money, finally bubbled over. The townspeople, who had lived under Miller's thumb for a decade, saw the coward behind the broadcloth. Silas surrendered his guns to the sheriff. He went to jail that day, but he went with his head held high. He spent 2 years in a stone cell, watching the seasons change through a sliver of a window. But every week a woman with a hickory cane sat on the other side of the bars. They didn't talk about the past. They talked about the fences they were going to build and the horses they were going to breed. When Silas was released on a crisp October morning, the air smelled of wood smoke and turning leaves. Clara was waiting at the gate. She didn't have the cane anymore. She walked with a slight limp, but she walked toward him with the strength of a woman who had reclaimed her soul. He didn't say he was sorry, and she didn't say she forgave him. Some things are too big for words. He simply took her hand and led her to the horse. As they rode back toward the high willow, the sun setting behind them in a riot of gold and purple, Silas looked at the horizon. It was still there, vast and uncaring, but he wasn't running from it anymore. He was home. "You stayed," she said softly, as the ranch house came into view. "I stayed," he replied. The frontier was a place of iron and dust, but as the first stars began to twinkle over the valley, Silas Thorne realized that the bravest thing a man could ever do was not to ride away into the sunset, but to stay and watch the sun come up with the woman he loved. The locket was still in his palm, but it didn't bite into his palm anymore. The metal was still warped, but the hinge worked, and for the first time in 10 years, it was closed.